understanding of what you have to give and what options you have. And I think being very clear about what you can offer, and it's noticeable how quickly the negotiations and the turnaround with Mexico and Canada happened, because they knew what they had to offer, what they were willing to offer, and they were able to strike a deal to at least stay the tariffs for a month. So I think being clear on that and having that ready to go is very important in this world. I do think, look, it does seem like he wants to make deal.
Us to make sure people understand the dangers of the world that we now live in.
And the other side of that equation,
not just over the border in the east, but on an assault to take the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. I remember. I was there. Good morning from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, a city, a country under fire. Well, that was 2022, and we are almost 3 years on in 2025. And joining me on the Today podcast is the man who was Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. He had that job soon after the Salisbury poisoning, which involved Russian agents bringing lethal Novichok agents into the country, and was also Chancellor, of course, a few months after the invasion of Ukraine. And my old BBC colleague, Bridget Kendall, who was diplomatic correspondent before that, Moscow correspondent during the Gorbachev years, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and long before that, well, not that long, of course, Bridget had been a student in Moscow, so knows the country incredibly well. Thanks very much indeed for joining me on the Today podcast.
nice to join you.
Hi, Nick. Pleasure to be here.
Can I start with getting your reaction to the question that I've just posed at the beginning of this podcast? Whose side is Donald Trump on? What do you judge, Bridget Kendall, from what you've heard?
Well, I think it's a bit worrying. The latest comments from President Trump do sound as though they're out of a Moscow playbook, blaming Ukraine for not reaching a deal sooner, even blaming it for provoking Russia into starting the war. You do have to wonder, though, with Donald Trump, if he's not just echoing the last conversation he had. How much does he think these things? But I remember back to last time round, when he was president last time round, when he mused on the idea that maybe Crimea ought to be Russian. So I think this is quite deep-seated and therefore very worrying.
Well, I agree with Bridget that it's worrying, but I think there's a very simple answer. He's not on Russia's side, he's not on Ukraine's side. He is, as he sees it, on America's side, and America's strategic interest, in his view, which is to extract itself from the financial cost of the Ukraine conflict and get a peace come hell or high water. Whatever costs either side have to pay, he wants a peace, and he wants it quickly. And for us in Europe, that is incredibly worrying, because he is less interested in the terms of that peace than we are, because for us it is absolutely essential that Putin doesn't get a win.
Peace at any price. That is quite alarming.
It is, and we have a different national interest to the United States in this situation. We need a lasting peace with a sovereign Ukraine that does not tempt Putin to come back for another bite. And that is why it is a complex situation in which our interests are not the same as America's. And we have to think very carefully what the outcome is that we require and how we're going to get there.
To really make sense of this, you've got to understand what Putin himself thinks, maybe what any Russian leader at this time would think, which is why a couple of days ago on the Today programme, I interviewed a man called Sergei Markov. He used to be Putin's spokesperson, is now an academic. He's sometimes dismissed as a propagandist for the Kremlin. But it's interesting to know what that propaganda is. Just have a listen to this.
It's a victory for Vladimir Putin, because it's helped Vladimir Putin to stop the war in Ukraine, which is regarded by Rosneft not as invasion to the neighboring country, but as a humanitarian operation of helping to the Russians who live in Ukraine, which been part of the Russia during 1,000 years.
I accused him on air of spouting propaganda after he suggested that a war that had killed thousands upon thousands could be described as a humanitarian operation. But what he says there would not be surprising to many people in Moscow, would it?
Well, of course, Russia and Ukraine have a long history together, and they're both Slavic nations, and most people in Russia would have been brought up with the thought that their country's history began in Kiev. So from their point of view, they see Kiev as an important part of their background. But I think if you dissociate Mr. Putin from ordinary Russian people, what's going on here is a big power play, and most of what he wants is to be treated like the leader of a world power which is on a par with the United States. It's always struck me through the many years that I've been going to Russia, and particularly to Putin's Russia, how focused top officials and Mr. Putin himself are on talking to the Americans. They may say that we live in a multipolar world and there are other actors, but they just want to talk to the Americans. So the big victory for Mr. Putin, which has already happened, is that 90-minute phone call from the American president willing to talk to him again and sending out